Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to day 2 of the 2020 Tralac Annual Conference. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to session 3. This morning, we're focusing on some of the work that we're doing at the Trade Law Center on the African Continental Free Trade Area. We're going to start off with a broad overview and an update on where the negotiations stand. We'll have a look at the agreement and its structure, its scope, its coverage, and then also share with you some of the important issues looking ahead towards implementation and the further development of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We will then focus on some specific issues that we are currently working on, including investment, and the very tricky, very interesting question of who is negotiating tariff concessions with who. We will also focus on trade and services, and importantly also on e-commerce, one of the important issues which has now been highlighted and brought forward and will be negotiated, we understand, in phase 2 of the negotiations. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel this morning. First of all, we have Professor Gerhard Erasmus, known to many of you. He is our international trade law expert and also the founder of Tralac. Willemien Viljoen, who works on law and economics. She's trained in law and economics, and she's going to be sharing with us the work that she is leading on the tariff and trade analysis, taking a look at who will be negotiating with who. Next, we have Dr. Talkmore Chidede, a Tralac researcher. He is, as many of you know, our expert on investment. He also works on trade data and policy analysis issues as well. Then we will also be joined by 2 colleagues who work with us from time to time. John Stewart is a Tralac associate. He works on trade and services issues, ICT and related issues, and is also the author who has developed the data science short course that we mentioned yesterday. We will also be joined by Dr. Ify Ogo. She joins us from Lagos this morning, and Ify has worked with us on the issues related to e-commerce and what the e-commerce protocol could look like. She's an expert on trade policy and legal issues and works as the regional expert to the UNDP on AfCFTA matters. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, what we will do is to start off with a brief presentation, then we will have contributions on the specific issues I have just mentioned, and then we will open for discussion. So as always, you're able to post questions and comments in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. I also would like to introduce you to the polling function. We are taking a poll and we would very much like your feedback on a number of questions that we're asking about this session. Your feedback is important to us. It provides guidance for our further work, which is particularly important in the overall development of Tralac's work program. Without further ado, I would like to start sharing my screen with you for the first part of this session. I'm pleased to invite Professor Erasmus to join me here for this presentation. So as I mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at how the AfCFTA regime will be implemented and how it will develop. This is a brief overview of the African Continental Free Trade Area and where we stand in terms of negotiations and preparations for implementation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's extremely important to recall and to remember that integrating 55 unequal partners, the members of the African Union, is a difficult and challenging task. It is an important one. It is absolutely necessary for Africa's future sustainable development. A status update: the African Continental Free Trade Area, as we know, has entered into force on the 30th of May 2019, but is not yet implemented. We are still negotiating key aspects for trade in goods and trade in services, which we'll cover in a minute. Professor Erasmus, over to you.
Good morning, Trudi. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm very pleased to join this session. We have designed this presentation by keeping in mind certain very important points that were made by our two key speakers yesterday, and both the Secretary General of the Secretariat of the AfCFTA and the Commissioner told us that the AfCFTA has tremendous potential and is very important, provided it is effectively implemented. And that is a key concept. We are going to look at implementation this morning, and we want to start off by reminding ourselves that the AfCFTA has been designed and the documents, the legal instruments have been adopted by sovereign states. Article 5 of the agreement states as the first principle underpinning this arrangement that it is member-driven. And when a trade arrangement is member-driven, it means that the members will negotiate and adopt those obligations that through the process of reciprocal negotiations and concessions, and they have agreed to implement over time. We have also heard from those two key speakers yesterday mentioning of other related concepts. And in the one instance when there was a question about infrastructural development, the answer was that is not part of our mandate at the Secretariat. Now, this concept of a mandate is another indication that sovereign states agree on obligations which they must implement and undertake to implement. And the AfCFTA has a dispute settlement arrangement as well. It is designed to be rules-based, but of course it is also designed to deal with what is possible and what is achievable over certain periods of time. The Commissioner was asked a question about, I think it was him, why certain countries have not yet ratified this agreement, and his answer was there are good reasons for that, and it is a decision of sovereign states that will determine when and how member states of the African Union ratify this agreement, and then they become state parties. We will emphasize the importance of this concept of the state parties. So the state parties, who are they? They are those negotiating AU members that have ratified or will in future exceed, and they will enjoy the benefits, but they will also be responsible for implementing the obligations. Talking about the obligations, they are mainly contained in the protocols at this stage, the protocol on trade in goods, trade in services, and dispute settlement. But the trade protocol on goods, for example, has a number. I think I've counted correctly. I think there are 9 annexes. And these annexes really contain the detail of the obligation. So if you want to understand what the state parties undertake to do, we have to read the annexes. If we want to know what will happen with respect to trade facilitation, read Annex 4. If you want to know what will happen with trade remedies, read Annex 9. And if you want to know what will happen in the context of standards and so on, SPS, TBT, customs administration, non-tariff barriers, all those vital disciplines that at the end of the day constitute the bulk of the obligation, and that is where we will have to make our assessments in order to determine how and at what pace this agreement is unfolding. I also want to mention that the AfCFTA agreement doesn't establish a new international organization, but the Secretariat, which we will look at in a little bit more detail in a minute, is a unique sui generis structure. It is up and running, but the detail about its functions must still be worked out. So here again, let us just recall that the Secretariat is going to be an extremely important institution within its mandate, and it will have to work with the state parties. It will have to work with, in some ways, also the African Union. And then very importantly, as we shall see, it will have to work with the existing RECs, customs unions on the continent, and regional trade arrangements. So we want to alert you to the fact that the Continental Free Trade Area is ambitious. It is not going to happen overnight. There is a game plan. There is a game plan in the various agreements. We're going to discuss that. And eventually the AfCFTA will have to grow over time in order to become a continental arrangement in the future. Trudi, I think we can go on to the next one. Now, very briefly, what must the state parties do? And at this point, although the AfCFTA agreement, which comprises all the instruments, the founding agreement, the protocols, the annexes, and what will be agreed also eventually in phase 2, this package contains the obligations of the state parties. At the moment, as I've said, the agreement is, Trudi said, is in force, but it cannot be implemented because vital matters are outstanding. One cannot have a free trade area without tariff reduction schedules and rules of origin. And in addition to this, the basic conditions for trade and services must also be finalized. So these negotiations are ongoing. They've been disrupted by COVID-19, but have been going on virtually, and we are all very keen to see what will come out of those decisions, because that is where the first important evidence will be available to talk about, or to discuss and to assess the trade liberalization effects. Article 4 of the agreement appears here on this slide, and it tells us what, in general terms, the state parties have undertaken to do under the auspices of the AfCFTA. This is the provision that deals with specific objectives. The state parties shall progressively eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers, progressively liberalize trade and services, cooperate on investment, IP, and competition policy, cooperate on trade-related areas such as customs, establish a mechanism for the settlement of disputes, and establish and maintain an institutional framework for the implementation and administration of the AfCFTA. I think you're starting to form a picture of the intention of the parties and the recipe, the game plan that they have agreed upon. That last bullet says something about a point made earlier, that the detail regarding the obligations appear in the annexes, and many of the disciplines are linked to WTO obligations and commitments. Examples are, for example, standards, trade remedies in particular, and then we'll also find, even in the Annex on Trade Facilitation, on which we heard a very important presentation yesterday, there will here and there be references to international standards and to the Trade Facilitation Agreement of the WTO. We can move on, Trudi. Trudi, I think you want to talk about this one. This is a diagram that Tralac has prepared to give an overview, a diagrammatic picture of the AfCFTA.
Ladies and gentlemen, this comes from a small tralac guide on the AfCFTA, and indeed it is edition 7, which we updated recently, given new information that's become available, and also in particular trade data updates. We monitor the trade data released by African member states and analyze intra-Africa trade, applicable tariffs, and so on in a lot of detail. So this is a link to that small booklet. This is really just a schematic representation of the architecture of the African Continental Free Trade Area. On the left, in the light green, this is those substantive issues negotiated in phase 1. And as Professor Erasmus indicated, there are 3 protocols which have been negotiated: trade in goods, trade in services, and dispute settlement. Under each of these, there are a number of annexes. And under the protocol on trade in goods and trade in services, the highlighted elements are the outstanding issues. These are currently under negotiation. And if we take a look at trade in goods, for example, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a surprise that these 2 issues are so difficult and taking so long to negotiate. Tariff concessions are very, very sensitive. They're sensitive for a number of reasons, including the fact, of course, that for many countries, tariff revenue is still an important element of overall government revenue. But tariffs are also a very effective means of limiting import competition, so protecting domestic industry. Rules of origin, again, very important. They serve the purpose of protecting the integrity of the free trade agreement, but they can also be used to protect domestic industry. So these belong together in the negotiations. We negotiate them usually in tandem. A lot of work has been done on the rules of origin negotiations already. There are 4 categories of products where the rules of origin negotiations are still ongoing: clothing and textiles, automotive products, edible oils, and sugar. For trade and services, the schedules are specific commitments. This takes us to the 5 priority services sectors, and we'll have a slide to say a little bit more about that. Phase 2, this is the one we are preparing for currently, ladies and gentlemen, and this will cover competition policy, intellectual property rights, and investment. And we've heard yesterday that e-commerce is to be elevated, moved forward to come under the phase 2 negotiations. So this is an important development for us to watch, and we will say a little bit more about that. Indications are that member states will negotiate instruments of cooperation on these phase 2 issues. So we'll have to see exactly what that will mean. Just in summary then, the outstanding negotiations for trade in goods, preferential tariff concessions and rules of origin, for trade and services, for the 5 priority services sectors: financial services, transport, communication, business services, and tourism. Ladies and gentlemen, given the COVID experience, there is some discussion about perhaps sometime in the future expanding this list to include, for example, healthcare services, education, and others. So very important to keep in mind, as was mentioned yesterday by our speakers, that the African Continental Free Trade Area does make provision for member states to negotiate further legal instruments as may be necessary. In addition to being a free trade area, ladies and gentlemen, it is extremely important to keep in mind that the African Continental Free Trade Area has a second life, so to speak. It is also a flagship project of the African Union, and therefore it finds synergy with a range of other initiatives under the broad banner of Agenda 2063, the African Union's development program for Africa. And some of those are very closely linked, of course, to the African Continental Free Trade Area, be it boosting intra-Africa trade, one of the important motivators for for expediting the conclusion of the African Continental Free Trade Area was to boost intra-Africa trade. Concerns about the member states having very, very little in terms of intra-Africa trade. We calculate for 2019 that stands at about 15% of total trade for Africa. PIDA, Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, AIDA, Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, boosting Africa's productive capacity, boosting its industrial capacity, diversifying its industries is particularly important to achieving the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So it fits into a much bigger development strategy for the continent. And I think this is extremely important to keep in mind. The synergies and complementarities with the other flagship projects are very important to achieving the very ambitious objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And we'll say a little bit more about that in the discussion later. There are also a number of related initiatives. So in addition to the flagship project, what we have seen is a number of very significant developments, and involved in a number of those is Africa's Export-Import Bank, AfCFTA. And it has become involved in initiatives way beyond its traditional area of business. So AfCFTA has announced a $1 billion AfCFTA adjustment facility. This is particularly to support those countries that may suffer revenue losses as a result of tariff liberalization. It is also developing a Pan-African payment and settlement system. And I think this is extremely important. Most transactions dealing with intra-Africa trade, investment, and so on are still cleared not on the continent, but elsewhere in the global economy. So this, very ambitious, of course, it will have to negotiate through complex domestic regulatory regimes in financial services and related sectors. AfCFTA, beyond its traditional area of business, is also supporting, ladies and gentlemen, a very important area, and that is quality assurance, standards related issues. I think this is an area of capacity that is absolutely critical, not only for the AfCFTA, but irrespective of who we trade with. And it's also important from a national development perspective. In South Africa, for example, not so long ago, we had the very, very sad experience of significant listeriosis outbreak. More than 200 lives were lost. So quality assurance, compliance with standards and technical regulations is not only about trade, but it's also about domestic development issues. Very recently, and I will skip over this very quickly, the Commissioner for Trade and Industry mentioned this yesterday, the African Medical Supplies Platform, which has been launched fairly recently. This, prompted very much by our COVID experience, is an online platform which provides access not only to African manufacturers, but also to global manufacturers. And this is very important to provide access to medical equipment and supplies, protective personal equipment, and so on. AfCFTA is involved here as well, ladies and gentlemen, to facilitate payments. There are logistics partners, freight forwarders, national carriers that will do the delivery. I think this is also important. It's linked to programs to support Africa's industrial development. And of course, there is, under the auspices of the African Union, a very important sector development program focusing on pharmaceutical capacity development across the continent. These collateral, complementary, related initiatives, ladies and gentlemen, are absolutely critical to support the achievement of the AfCFTA as an instrument for Africa's sustainable development. Professor Erasmus, over to you.
Thank you, Trudi. Ladies and gentlemen, we at Tralac have coined a term in describing certain features of the AfCFTA, and we call it parallelism. And I want to run very quickly through the contents of Article 19 of the agreement and Article 8 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods, just to emphasize a very important feature, part of the architecture of the AfCFTA. It is not going to be, when it's implemented, this continental free trade area. It will coexist together and alongside existing African trade arrangements. Now, Article 19 begins by making a standard observation about how a new trade agreement and existing ones will relate to each other. That's a standard provision to say that if there is an inconsistency in wording and text, then this agreement shall prevail to the extent of the inconsistency. But of course, that applies only to when there is an issue about jurisdiction. Normally, international trade agreements run parallel with each other because that is the reality and that is how they are designed. The more important point in Article 19 is the following. Notwithstanding the provisions of this paragraph, state parties that are members of other regional economic communities, the RECs, regional trading arrangements and customs union, which have attained among themselves higher levels of regional integration than under this agreement, shall maintain such higher levels among themselves. In other words, the RECs will not disappear and the customs unions and other trading arrangements will coexist. And if we think about that for a moment, it makes perfectly good sense. The levels of integration in, for example, SADC or the EAC will in many areas be higher simply because they have been in existence for a much longer time and also because they have smaller configurations of membership. And remember that there's another reason, an arrangement like SADC is not only a trade arrangement. SADC has more than, I think, about 25 protocols, and they deal with a vast range of matters about energy, industrial development, services, investment, sharing water courses, and so on. So there are many obvious reasons why they will continue to exist. We will see in a minute that not all RECs are FTAs at the moment, and that will also have to be expedited. Article 8.2 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods is even more to the point. State parties that are members of other RECs, which have attained among themselves higher levels of elimination of customs duties and trade barriers than those provided for in this protocol, shall maintain and, where possible, improve upon those higher levels of trade liberalization. So the consequences are that the AfCFTA as a free trade area will exist along other free trade areas, and we will therefore have to distinguish between existing intra-REC preferences, new AfCFTA preferences for specific state parties, and moving towards continental preferences. So just to make an example, or to give an example, if under the future dispensation, if a firm is producing in Zambia and exporting to, let's say, to Zimbabwe, another SADC member states, they will do so under the rules and the rules of origin and tariffs of SADC. On the other hand, those African states that do not yet at this point belong to one and the same REC at the moment, they presently have to trade with each other in goods under the MFN rules of the WTO. So if this arrangement comes into place, the AfCFTA, then we will have this new preferential trade arrangements, which will allow for preferential trade between African states that have become state parties, that is a proviso, and they will enjoy the preferences that are still being negotiated. Next point, Trudi, or next slide. That's yours.
These are simply the 8 regional economic communities, ladies and gentlemen, that are recognized by the African Union as building blocks of the African Economic Community, and also recognized in the AfCFTA agreement. They will continue to exist. as Professor Erasmus has indicated. Another trading arrangement, which is under negotiation at the moment and is also covered in the articles that Professor Erasmus has looked at, Article 19, is the tripartite free trade area negotiations. This is a set of negotiations by the member states belonging to SADC, the East African Community, and COMESA, still work in progress, but this will continue to exist presumably too. Just a brief note that intra-trade, although very low by comparison with other regions across the globe, is highly concentrated within the regional economic communities, and Willemien will say something about that a little bit later. Our final section deals with the institutions. Professor Erasmus, over to you.
Yeah, very briefly, ladies and gentlemen, we have the Assembly of the African Union as an oversight institution mentioned in Article 10 of the agreement, and it is the apex organization, the body. The Council of Ministers and the Committee of Senior Trade Officials, I refer to them as the membership platforms. Only the state parties will participate through these two bodies. And in the case of the Council of Ministers, it will be the trade ministers or specially designated ministers. And this council, which will meet twice a year under normal circumstances, and which will take its decisions by consensus, is responsible for implementing and enforcing the AfCFTA agreement. It may issue regulations and directives and recommendations, and will report to the AU Assembly through the AU Executive Council. The Committee of Senior Trade Officials, only meeting twice a year, taking decisions by consensus. It's here where we will find the permanent or principal secretaries or directors general. They will assist their ministers, will implement further the council decisions, request investigations, directs the secretariat to undertake certain assignments, promote harmonization, etc. And then, very importantly, we cannot list all of them here, but there are a vast number of we can go on to, of other institutions. I just want to mention that literally each and every one of the annexes will provide for a specialized body. The Protocol on Trade in Goods creates a Trade in Goods Committee. And it's important to just repeat that only the state parties will be involved here. But the point that we can make is that institutionally, there are no supranational institutions, but there are a wide range of technical and political institutions which will provide for interaction and for practical work, practical follow-up. And then Trudi can say something later about the African Trade Observatory and the online mechanism. But let me finally say that Article 13 is an important agreement, Article 13 of provision of the agreement, because it deals with the Secretariat. Let's just run very quickly, verbatim through what Article 13 says, because there are so many expectations about how the Secretariat will in future contribute to the unfolding AfCFTA. Given this parallelism design, matters are not going to be easy in that sense, but if everyone pulls in the same direction, and that can be facilitated, then a new ball game is about to start on the continent. And the Secretariat shall be functionally autonomous body within the AU system with an independent legal personality. Now, I've said that the AfCFTA agreement does not create an international organization, but it does provide in this provision for independent legal personality of the Secretariat, obviously within its mandate. The Secretariat shall be autonomous from the AU Commission. Funds for the Secretariat shall come from the overall budget of the AU, and the roles and responsibility of the Secretariat must still be determined by the Council of Ministers. Trudi, do you want to say something about the ATO and the mechanism, or shall we continue?
Let's continue. We have about 1 minute to finish.
Okay. Now, where and how will the RECs fit into the AfCFTA design? Well, we have seen that the agreement tells us they will continue to exist, and under Article 8 of the Goods Protocol will even advance their own agendas. So they will continue to exist. And now, the RECs, it is said in Article 12, shall be represented in the Committee of Senior Trade Officials in an advisory capacity. Now, this is rudimentary. I don't know what they will amount to, but the detail will have to work out. Then it says that the Secretariat, working with state parties, RECs, and partners, shall coordinate and provide technical assistance, capacity building in trade and related issues for the implementation of this protocol. This Article 29 of the Goods Protocol, I think, tells us something about work still to be structured and still to be implemented. The same protocol in Article 31 says the Council of Ministers shall establish the Committee on Trade in Goods, which shall carry out such functions as may be assigned to it by the Council of Ministers to facilitate the operation of this protocol on goods and further its objectives. And it may, and there will be subsidiary bodies. Trudi, you can give the concluding remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, there's of course a lot of work to be done on implementation, and we look forward to discussing that further, but we will end our presentation here. And it's now my great pleasure to invite Ify Ogo to speak to us about what we can expect in the protocol on e-commerce. Ify, over to you.
Thank you very much, Trudi. I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen. Give me a minute. Can you see the screen?
Yes, thanks very much, Ify. That's great.
Okay, thank you very kindly. So I'm thinking about e-commerce in the AfCFTA. I think it's interesting because e-commerce itself is not yet quite defined as a topic. And so I'll just run through what could be the elements we could think of as we begin to shape up this new protocol in the CFTA. And so first I'll start with what is e-commerce. And the benchmarks we often use would be the World Trade Organization or the OECD. And these essentially speak to trade as we understand trade, transactions as we have them for goods and for services, but which occur through e-channels. And so it just says, okay, fine, it's trade as we know it, but through e-channels. And then who does e-commerce cover? It might be your typical e-commerce marketplace, or it might be a normal business, or a structured one like a bank or food service provider that also sells through e-commerce channels. So e-commerce, what we see is that it's wide-ranging and all-encompassing in the economy of now. And so why are we thinking about an e-commerce protocol in the AfCFTA? Why is this important? Why don't we just focus on goods and on services and all the other structural things we have to deal with? Because practically speaking, I would say, and I think that this is a view shared by quite a few people, that intra-Africa trade will be driven by e-commerce, because how are we going to trade? How do we know what's on offer? Where? How do we pay? How do we sort all of our transactions out? So e-commerce is going to be, I would say, the driver of trade within the continent and through the CFTA. And so these are some of the issues that you think about when you see an e-commerce chapter in a trade deal. It could be anything. On one hand, you could be dealing with tariffs, duties, products, terms of trade. On the other hand, you're dealing with your orthodox rules for consumer protection, for electronic transactions, for electronic signatures. And then you will have your facilitation things there to say, okay, it'd be ideal to do this or to do that. And then sometimes it might not have anything to do with rules at all, but it would be to try and enable the investment into the infrastructure that you need to actually trade via e-commerce. And so in thinking about the e-commerce protocol of the CFTA, one then has to say, what are we trying to achieve with this protocol? What are the things we need? How are they treated? And what do we do? And so in thinking about a protocol itself, we have to ask what a protocol does. And a protocol essentially sets out the ambitions, it sets out the objectives, it sets out the approach, it says, here's what we're trying to do. So if you look at the goods protocol in this, it would say, this is what we're trying to do with goods. We want to take up tariffs on trade. Here are the institutions that will be responsible for doing it. Here's the timeline, here's the approach, here's how we will know the benchmarks for having done the thing we want to set out to do. So for the e-commerce protocol, what would be our objective? What would be the approach? We have some sense we have some sense in the sense that we want some authority on all aspects of e-commerce. We want to own our data, we want to own our products, and we want to enable the emergence of e-commerce platforms across board. But could this be the only thing? I would think that there's a bit more to think about with e-commerce, seeing as that it really will drive trade across the continent. And so I propose the following things to think about. In a sense, they're not just going back to the list of things saying, oh, we want to facilitate trade, or we want to have Googles and APC. But I would think that we should think first about what we want the e-commerce protocol to be. What is it anyway? Who are we trying to capture? Are we thinking about the businesses? Are we thinking about SMEs? Are we thinking about public sector? I think we would need to say what is e-commerce in the CFTA. What do we think it is, and who are we trying to deal with this protocol? In terms of scope, are we going to think about trading goods, physical services? Are we also going to think about goods that are like software? Are we going to think about tutoring online? Are we going to think about medical services online? I think we have to have a clear scope as to what we'll be thinking about with e-commerce. To what extent does this work? And also to what extent does this help the other things that we're trying to do with goods and with services? And then in terms of purpose, what are we trying to? Are we trying to liberalize as with goods or services, or are we trying to regulate? How will this interact with what exists? Because there are rules that exist. So how does this e-commerce protocol work with all of these other rules that exist with the rest and with the member states themselves? I would also think that we specifically have to think about coherence, in the sense that we can't have conflicting rules. We can't have not knowing what applies where and what doesn't apply where. We really want another spaghetti bowl of rules. We really want to understand how things will work with e-commerce. For example, there's a convention on data and privacy. How would an e-commerce protocol interact with this? Is it going to use the convention as a benchmark, or is it going to create a whole new set of rules? So we also have to understand that. And then finally, I would say that we also have to take a look as to what's happening at the World Trade Organization itself. The African group has been opposed to e-commerce rules here on the basis that it wants to preserve policy space for African countries. That we also haven't got what we want from the other parts, and it's saying, oh no, we don't want to create rules here for African countries. But the thing is that some African countries have said they would be interested in going to make rules outside of the World Trade Organization. And so now we have to point out that the dynamics of making rules outside the World Trade Organization will not be the same as if you were to do it inside of it, because the power dynamics will change, the issues will change. So I think that all of these issues have to be thought about in the way we frame the protocol. We think about what we want to achieve on the continent, and think about what's happening also outside the continent. People then say these could be the potential objectives for the CFTA, and here would be the approach to do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Ify. Without further ado, may we turn to John Stewart to talk to us a little bit about the trade and services work we're doing. What we do note, ladies and gentlemen, is of course that when we take a look at trade and services data, we still have quite a lot of work to do to improve the quality, the availability of data. John, over to you.
Thanks, Trudi. I'm just getting my presentation started here. There we go. And now I just need to share it. Let me just attempt that again. Right, here we go. All right, everyone see that okay? Is that okay? Can everyone see that?
Thank you, John. Yes, we can.
Okay. All right, thanks, Trudi. So I'm going to be looking at, trying to put trade and services in context, and trying to get an idea of the importance of services. It's a frequently overlooked part of trade, but it's critically important, not just because it's in itself, but also because services are inputs into the production of physical goods, merchandise goods. I'm going to look at the trade and services overall, and then focus in the second half on mode 3, which is the foreign affiliates trade and services. That's the largest by far, and so that justifies special attention. All right, if we look at this donut chart, this breaks down for a recent year the sub parts of trade and services, mode 1 to 4. Starting with the orange part of the donut, we see that 27.7% of total trade and services is mode 1, which is cross-border transactions. So that is a sale of a service, a production of a service in one country, sale to another country. So an engineer, a firm of engineers does a design plan. They do a plan of a design and they sell it to another country, or software is developed in one country and it's sold to a different country, but there's no movement of the personnel. The light blue part of the donut, 10.4%, is consumption abroad. When I travel and I consume services in another country, if I catch an Uber or I go to a hotel, so it's much of it is tourism, but also business travel as well. And that's 10%, but by far the largest component of trade and services is mode 3, which is commercial presence. So that's affiliates of a service industry or service company that are opened in a foreign country. So a good example in Cape Town here, we have Amazon Web Services that are established here in Cape Town, and they're an affiliate of Amazon Global. For example, in Nairobi, you have Oracle, which is a database giant. Another good example would be the large consultancies, KPMG, Deloitte, that have subsidiaries or affiliates in countries. Throughout Africa, we find those kind of companies. They've been in the news here in a negative light, but we won't go into that. But that's what we mean. Now, the smallest part, 2.9%, is the presence of individuals. So if I, as an economist, travel to another country and I'm paid in that country, then that would be mode 4. Now, the importance of mode 3 is really what underlies that is the growth in services overall in terms of as a proportion of world output. Services are becoming more important and have for some time been more important than, or grown faster than merchandise trade. And so as a part of that, we find this importance of commercial services. So let's look at the different subsectors within commercial services and the trade. Now, within this group of these subsectors of services, you have traditional and you also have new types of services. So the traditional services are distribution, financial, transport, and construction. This bar chart shows the level of trade and services for 2005 in light blue, and in dark blue is the share in 2017. So it shows growth over a 12-year period. And we can see that distribution and financial services have grown, but telecommunications, computer services, audiovisuals, new, in other words, tech-driven services are the third largest, and they've grown much faster than the traditional services. So they displaced transport. In 2005, transport was the third largest service type, and these tech-driven services, ICT, have now displaced that as the third largest. And other types of services down the line, such as business services, professional services, intellectual property related, even educational services, are now strongly driven by tech, by ICT, which is the ultimate backward linked service. The point of this is that the negotiations for the AfCFTA must recognize how important services are, firstly, but also important the tech backward linked services are, the ICT services are to driving the rest of these services, and how critical these are to development and progress as economies in the globe today. This graph, these two bar graphs show trade and services exports on the left and imports on the right, and it compares overall developing economies which are the left bars in each graph with the LDCs. And it shows that the rate of growth of exports and imports for LDCs between 2005 and 2017 is quite strong. For exports, yes, it's about 50%, but imports, it's even stronger. And this shows that even LDCs, least developed countries, have found it necessary to begin trade and services and to take that into account. And so we have most LDCs we have in Africa, and therefore we must know that when you regulate trade and services, and when this is part of the AfCFTA, you are negotiating around the viability of these economies and as a crucial input into these economies. When we look at two pie charts breaking down for 2017 the importance of trade and services, exports and imports, we see for developing Asia the component of the world total is much greater than for Africa, but Africa does import about 50% more than it exports in services. So this will start to change, and the integration in Africa and getting right the protocols behind trade and services is so important to improving these numbers. Who are the top services importers and exporters among Africa? We expect the largest economies to be the main importers and exporters of services, but we see an interesting thing where Nigeria, being a top importer and one of the largest economies, I think it's now the largest economy on GDP, is only the 7th largest exporter of services. South Africa, which has a more developed tech sector, is both a strong importer and exporter. And then we have Egypt being up there. Ghana, interestingly, is a strong exporter of services. So the patterns you'd expect are roughly there, but we also have some interesting countries that are strong exporters, such as Ghana and Kenya. Now I wish to move towards mode 3, trade and services, which are also known as FATS, foreign affiliate trade and services, and also compare this to outward investment. Now to start, I apologize for any confusion, but I used OECD data. And so this data is from the perspective of OECD, is outward investment. So outward investment by OECD countries to the rest of the world. And so from the perspective of Africa, this is inward investment. I'm going to not go through these. I'm going to go straight to the charts. This slide and the next slide talk about what's on the chart. So I'm not going to pause there. I just want to talk about the data. It's from 2010 to 2016. From 2017, it's incomplete. The variable for investment is the number of employees in organizations. There's 5 other variables, but the data is incomplete for Africa. And the charts that are below are dual axis charts where we can compare African totals with world totals. So the world totals on the right and Africa totals on the left. So they are for proportional comparison, not for absolute comparison. Firstly, outward investment from the globe to Africa, to North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the rest of the world are given in this chart. And you can see a strong growth in Sub-Saharan Africa, the green line, strong growth from 2010 to 2013, and then a bit of a dip. But it reflects the global increase in FATS, which is the blue line. Now, Africa's investment in Africa and output in Africa is tied to the commodity cycle, which took a dip after 2013, and that reflects it. By contrast, North Africa, it's relatively flat. The amount of investment is relatively flat. The growth rate is relatively slow. If we look at the same data for manufacturing, we see a dip for Africa. So the green line dips after the commodity cycle. So the interesting comparison then is that FATS is less sensitive than manufacturing investment into Africa for Sub-Saharan Africa. For North Africa, there seems to be, there's very little change. But Sub-Saharan Africa, being very much primary output driven, is sensitive to the commodity cycle from the perspective of manufacturing investment. Now, if we look at, if we total the figures for investment into Africa for those 6 years, and we compare them with the proportions for the globe, we see that total services is proportionately greater than manufacturing investment. So FATS actually exceed proportionately the investment in manufacturing. The middle bar is total business sector. So that's industry in general, and that a lot of those industries are primary sector related, which we know Africa specializes in. So the importance of this data is that is that fats, mode 3, is not just important globally, it's now more important in absolute terms globally than manufacturing, but for Africa, it's the same. It is as important. And interestingly, if you look at the green bar, proportionately more for sub-Saharan Africa than for North Africa. And that is very interesting. So going forward, we have to understand the importance of services, not just trade and services modes 1, 2, and 4, but also foreign affiliate trade and services, which are very important for Africa and cannot be understated. All right, I'm out of time. This slide just reflects what I've got there, but thank you very much. And Trudi, I hand over to the next participant.
Thank you so much, John. Willemien, over to you. Willemien's going to share with us very briefly some of the work we're doing on who negotiates with whom and what the key issues are. Thank you so much, Willemien. We are a bit tight on time, so we'll have a summary and share more detailed slides a bit later. Thanks, Willemien.
Thank you very much, Trudi. Yes, so Trudi has just asked me to look at some of the basic principles when we're looking at the tariff negotiations under the AfCFTA. So this is just the introduction. Like Trudi said, there's a lot more details and we will be sharing those slides. So like Professor Erasmus also stated, that who's going to negotiate with whom will depend inter alia on the level of integration that's been achieved among the RECs and trading agreements as well as the customs unions. So if we look at some of the basic principles, then we've got 32 African countries, which are part of 4 RECs which do have a common external tariff. So those are ECOWAS, EAC, SACU, and CMAC. And in order to protect the integrity of these common external tariffs, these RECs will then negotiate together, the countries will negotiate together in those groupings where they've got a common external tariff. So for instance, if we look at ECOWAS, ECOWAS will be negotiating with SACU, CMAC, and the EAC, but then also with some individual countries like Algeria and Mauritius, where there is currently no tariff preferences in place. So because there is no tariff preferences currently in place, the trade liberalization do then create some potential for future trading opportunities. Then we also have some RECs where there are free trade agreements in place, and this is then COMESA and SADC. So these countries within these FTAs, they will be negotiating as individuals. And this will greatly depend on what the level of integration are which has been achieved, and then they will also be negotiating with countries where there currently are no trade preferences. So both in the case of COMESA and SADC, there are some countries of the RECs which are not part of the FTAs of those RECs. So currently under the COMESA FTA, there's no liberalization offered by the DRC and Somalia. So there's also no liberalization reciprocated for goods imported by those 2 countries into the rest of the COMESA FTA countries. And there's also then partial liberalization in terms of Ethiopia and Eritrea. And this partial liberalization is then reciprocated in terms of imports from those 2 countries into the rest of the COMESA FTA. So Ethiopia currently has liberalized 10% of its tariff lines, and then Eritrea 80% at the moment. Also in terms of the SADC FTA, the DRC, Comoros, and Angola, they have not joined the FTA yet, although Angola recently did submit an offer to join the FTA. So once again, no liberalization with those 3 countries, either for imports from the SADC FTA countries into those, but also then for imports from those 3 countries into the rest of the SADC FTA countries as well. So if we look, for instance, at Mauritius, who will they negotiate with? So Mauritius is part of both the COMESA and the SADC FTAs, and they have also fully liberalized all their tariff lines for imports coming from those FTA member states. So in terms of imports from the DRC, Angola, and Somalia, there is currently no liberalization. They are levied the MFN tariffs. They have also liberalized 90% of the tariff lines for imports coming both from Ethiopia and Eritrea. So there shouldn't be any tariff negotiations with these countries. seeing that there is already a high level of liberalization achieved. So once again, Mauritius will be negotiating with those countries where there currently are no preferences, like for instance, ECOWAS, CMAC, and then individual countries, for instance, Mauritania. Then lastly, we've got AMU, IGAT, ECAS, and CENSAT, so 4 regs, where there currently is no trade agreements in place. So there has been no tariff liberalization, which has taken place for intra-reg trade within these regs. However, when we look at overlapping membership, is what we find is that there is already a high degree of liberalization for trade amongst some of these countries which are part of these regs, because they are part of other regs where there is liberalization in place. So for instance, if we look at AMU, all the AMU countries except for Mauritania have already achieved duty-free trade amongst themselves under PAFTA. And then there's also a Mauritania-Morocco FTA in place. So in the case for Mauritania, although it's part of CENSAT and AMU, and also there is a the Morocco FTA in place, Mauritania is most likely going to have to negotiate with all the African countries because of the lack of tariffs for CENSAT and AMU. And then also under the FTA with Morocco, only 33% of the MFN tariff lines have been liberalized thus far. Also under IGAT, what we find is a high degree of tariff liberalization, which has also actually taken place due to the fact that all the IGAT member states, except for Somalia, are already part of either the EAC or the COMESA FTA. So in the case of Somalia, once again, it's part of IGAT and CENSAT, where there is no tariff preferences in place. It's part of COMESA, but not the COMESA FTA. So once again, we will have to look at tariff liberalization and tariff negotiations for all the other African countries. So if we look at the tariff negotiations, these will take place, like Professor said, on the basis of MFN, or then countries will begin with their general tariffs if they are not part of the WTO. So if we look at these tariffs in place, there are some space for some countries to offer significant reductions under the AfCFTA. For instance, the ECOWAS Common External Tariff, only 2% of the tariff lines are actually duty-free. Significant portions of the tariff lines are levied either 10% or 20% duty. So there are some room for improvements. While if we look at other countries, for instance, Mauritius, more than 90% of the MFN tariffs for Mauritius are already duty-free. So there's not a lot of room to move to offer any additional tariff liberalization in terms of the AfCFTA and negotiations. Thank you very much, Trudi.
Thank you so much, Willemien. It's complicated, I think, when you take a look at these negotiations. Talkmore, over to you to talk to us about investment in the context of the AfCFTA. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Trudi. So I've been requested to talk about the Continental Free Trade Area as an investment incentive for Africa. As we have seen that most of the African countries have acknowledged and recognized investment as a development tool at regional, national, and continental levels. So my task is just to highlight some of the dynamic benefits for free trade areas that the Continental Free Trade Area will present for investment. So I will highlight very few key areas that will attract foreign investors and investment from Africa and outside the continent, both small and big. And because of these areas, if they are addressed well in the African Continental Free Trade Area, we will see foreign investors buying, controlling stocks in African enterprises, creating affiliates for sourcing and outsourcing inputs, and for the provision of trade and for the provision of goods and services in the African countries. So please note that the extent to which the Continental Free Trade Area will attract and bring foreign investors to the continent, it largely depends on how these key areas that I'm going to talk about are managed and implemented. So the focus of my presentation is just to put out the areas that need urgent attention and the highest level of political will and commitment or effective implementation to attract foreign investors into Africa. So I will talk, these are the main points that I will talk about. I'm not going to waste time going into discussing the African Continental Free Trade Area as a flagship program of the African Union, because Trudi has already discussed that in the preceding session and how it is important to attract foreign investors and investment. So I'll focus on the last three main points. So as we know that foreign investors and investment are attracted by market size, openness, economic growth, policy certainty, and other things. So to the extent the African Continental Free Trade Area reduces and eliminates tariffs, this is something that Willemien has already discussed and Professor Erasmus and Trudi mentioned in their deliberations. And to the extent the African Continental Free Trade Area integrate African markets and economies or adequately address non-tariff concerns or trade facilitation issues, and enhance trade and investment policy certainty, or contribute to greater economic growth of the African economies, mostly will attract market-seeking and efficient-seeking foreign direct investment into Africa. As we know that the African Continental Free Trade Area will create an expanded continental market for goods, services, and investment, even a market of 1.2 billion people and a combined GDP of $3 trillion US. And African countries have agreed to liberalize 90% of their tariff lines to intra-Africa trade in goods. And the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement also contains various legal instruments that seek to address non-tariff and trade facilitation concerns. And this will immensely help to reduce cross-border trade transaction costs for businesses and people. And the Continental Free Trade Area also covers some of the substantive disciplines that are critical to foreign direct investment activities and strategies, including trading services that John had just discussed, intellectual property, competition policy, and e-commerce. So in as far as trading services are concerned, to the extent that the African Continental Free Trade Area reduces regulatory barriers to trading services across the continent, this will attract foreign investors into the services sector, since it will ease the supply of services across the continent through cross-border transaction, commercial presence, consumption abroad, presence of natural persons. I think John discussed this in detail, and as well as intellectual property regime under the Continental Free Trade Area is likely to attract foreign investors if it facilitates the registration of patents, it protects and drives innovation across the continent. And in as far as e-commerce is concerned, to the extent that the e-commerce protocol or regime under the African Continental Free Trade Area leverages the digital divide across the continent, this will attract foreign investors into the digital economy. The other important area that the African Continental Free Trade Area will lure foreign investors is through improved trade and investment government. We know that the African Continental Free Trade Area is a rules-based arrangement. So if it improves trade and investment governance across the continent, we're likely to see more foreign investors, and this instills confidence in investors that they will be protected under the African Continental Free Trade Area. And this is an area where the protocol on investment has to manage the investment governance very well. So it has to improve the investment governance and establish a continental legal regime for investment, which is clear, transparent, and predictable. And I just want to highlight some of the few areas that the protocol should address. So it should endeavor to address the regulatory barriers to investment entry in Africa, to reduce time and cost for investment approvals. So this touches more on the investment facilitation. Investment facilitation is one of the key areas that need to be addressed across the investment regime in most of the countries and regional arrangements. And the protocol also has to address or enhance transparency and improve efficiency and enhance the investment-related cooperation and coordination across the continent. And the most important area is to address the fragmentation of investment regulatory frameworks. If you look at the investment regulatory regimes, they are so fragmented intra-regionally and inter-regionally. So it's an important area that the investment protocol should try to address, such that we have a coherent and coordinated investment legal framework across the continent. And the other important area that the investment protocol should seek to address is issues of investment dispute settlement. Investors, they would want to have direct access to dispute settlement mechanism and access to remedies when their rights are violated by host governments. And so what am I saying? Am I advocating for increased investment into Africa? The ultimate goal should not be to attract more investment into Africa, but we have to attract foreign direct investment, quality foreign investment that will deliver on the sustainable development needs of the continent. Investment that can help the African continent or economies to address some of the challenges like the youth unemployment, skills development, industrialization, women empowerment, infrastructure development, or investment that builds our industries, investment that connects international and regional markets, drives innovation and competitiveness. And the goal is as well to attract both big and small investors from and into all African countries, regions, and more specifically into strategic growth sectors like agro-processing, clothing and textile, natural resource beneficiation, services, and digital economy. These services are important in the sense that they provide stimulus towards sustainable development, industrialization, and create quality employment, and as well as build the 21st century economies that we do need in Africa. Thank you very much, Trudi. These are my contributions.
Thank you so much, Talkmore. Ladies and gentlemen, Talkmore and I discuss that quite often. The interest globally in the Continental Free Trade Area is particularly notable. And this will, of course, be particularly important, as he has mentioned, to expanding our productive capacity, but also to contributing to the important development ambitions and goals that we have set, not only for the African Continental Free Trade Area, but at national and regional levels as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like on your behalf to thank all of our presenters. This has been an extremely interesting range of presentations. We are seeing a lot of interesting questions coming through. We will not have time to address all of them, ladies and gentlemen, but as we mentioned yesterday, we will have a newsletter which you will all receive at the end of the week, which will contain answers to the questions which we do not get to. We have a few questions in the Q&A box about global trade relations, and focusing specifically on the Kenya-US negotiations. Professor Erasmus, may I ask you to answer this very briefly? What are the implications for the AfCFTA, considering the current trade agreement between Kenya and the US? Obviously, this is still under negotiation. It comes from Ali and Dao. Thank you, Ali, for that. Professor Erasmus, over to you. Please unmute your microphone, Professor Erasmus.
That's the good thing about having Trudi around. She gives the necessary instructions. Let's not forget that in addition to the US-Kenya talks that are being launched, at present there is also a very important issue pending between Kenya and the United Kingdom, and that relates to Brexit. So just making the point that external trade relationships are extremely important for a large number of our states. First question, will the AfCFTA allow trade negotiations and new trade agreements to be negotiated and concluded with third parties? It states so explicitly that that will be the case. And of course, there is a little proviso that it must not undermine the commitments that are now being undertaken. That is standard practice. If you look at any of our FTAs like SADC, take SACU, for example. SACU has a number of very important trade agreements with third parties like the EU and EFTA and Mercosur and so on. So legally speaking, it is possible. The second question is, how will the membership of Kenya of the EAC impact if one of the member states, Kenya, negotiates a third-party agreement with the United States? That is probably, as a first level issue, more important for the time being, because the EAC purports to be a customs union. It may be a customs union in progress, but it has a common external tariff. So one of the issues that must be discussed and sorted out is, if goods enter the market of Kenya as a result of an FTA, and it may be services and all other related disciplines, what will be the consequences be for the further movement of those goods in the EAC if the other parties are not members of a trade agreement with the US? So obviously that will figure on that will be a prominent issue to be decided on the unfolding negotiations with Washington. When it comes to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there will be a general concern about trade deflection, about sidestepping the rules for preferential trade in Africa amongst the member states, the state parties of the AfCFTA, if third-party agreements will result in the potential undermining of the benefits that they give each other. Now, this is not exceptional. It is a fact of life that we are all integrated into the global economy, and the AfCFTA is not designed to stop that. As a matter of fact, the opposite is true. So the technical implication is, and let me summarize, the AfCFTA recognizes that trade agreements with third parties, existing ones and new ones, will be possible. There's a qualification in the sense that such preferences that are being offered to third parties must, on the basis of reciprocity, also be, the opportunity must also be extended to other AfCFTA state parties. So to summarize the technical. I know it's politically maybe more complicated, but technically, yes, Kenya obviously will want to retain the benefits that it has in terms of trade with the UK, with the rest of the world under AGOA, and AGOA may come to an end. The big challenge will be how to protect the integrity of the EAC, and that requires discussions with EAC parties. And for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, what does it mean to extend those benefits on the basis of reciprocity, not an automatic multiplier to the other state parties of the AfCFTA? So we can expect some action here, but action there must be.
Thank you very much, Professor Erasmus. There are a number of questions on e-commerce, and a comment which I would like to ask Willemien and Talkmore to respond to. And it highlights the important link between the trade facilitation agenda and the e-commerce agenda when we're talking about goods purchased electronically. It also comes from Ali and Dao. Willemien, let's turn to you first, just to share a little bit of your insights on the trade facilitation agenda and the e-commerce agenda, that interconnection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trudi. Yes, so there's definitely a link between, the trade facilitation and then also the e-commerce, and especially then also services like John Stewart highlighted as well, in terms with the soft infrastructure as well, where especially in trade facilitation, like we saw yesterday as well with some of the presentations, countries are not doing as well when it comes to automation and things like that. And, that will also have a big implication if we're looking at e-commerce, depending on how we're looking at the e-commerce. Like if you said, there is different, it's not just trading the things across the border, but it's various things that's got to do with e-commerce. So in terms of the trade facilitation, like if you said as well, a lot of the trade will possibly be based on e-commerce, especially for the AfCFTA, intra-Africa trade. A lot of it might be motivated by e-commerce, purchasing things online and then shipping it across borders. And, that has to do a lot with the trade facilitation as well. So there's definitely a direct link when we're looking at e-commerce and trade facilitation, not just in terms of purchasing the thing on the internet, but also having access to some of those services as well, your ITC, and then also getting that thing from one country to the next, where we're then also dealing with other services related things like automation and but then also getting the goods from the one country to the next through transit and all of those things. So there's definitely a link between trade facilitation and e-commerce, and then e-commerce, needs trade facilitation, and also then, trade facilitation can then also improve e-commerce between all the African countries as well.
Thanks very much, Willemien, for that. I think from the perspective of the broad trade facilitation agenda that we discussed yesterday, I think it's clear that this has much broader impact also on, for example, investment, talk more so facilitation of access to inputs that may be required. Talk more very briefly, a response from you on that. So the link between trade facilitation and leveraging investment.
Thank you very much, Trudi. I'd say that addressing e-commerce is very important, especially at this moment, post-COVID-19, as we have seen that most of the companies now are moving into the digital sphere. So if we need to address e-commerce, it's very important to have that regime that addresses and harmonize e-commerce in the digital, that harmonizes companies or regulatory regimes in the digital sphere. And this is very important as well when it comes to attracting foreign investment, because those are companies that are moving into the electronic commerce, they would likely want to move into the digital platforms as well. And linking this to trade facilitation, this will require us to have digital trade solutions to ensure that we have smooth flow of services or goods in the digital platform. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Talkmore. John, as the closing comment, I'd like to ask you to say a little bit about trade data. And we are looking forward to the launch of the African Trade Observatory. But you did mention in passing that trade and services data is still a challenge when it comes to doing really interesting analysis on what we could be achieving in the trade and services sphere. Some thoughts on that?
Yes, it's challenging, Trudy, because merchandise trade data passes through the customs route, and governments are very keen, obviously, to collect the duties on it where duties are applicable. But trade and services data is much easier. It's much easier to slip through the net, because you've now got international payments gateways such as PayPal that allow digitally delivered goods, things like design and entertainment, digital entertainment, to be transacted just using a credit card. So collecting the data is a challenge even in developed countries. So more of a challenge for developing countries. Just to give you some of idea, when I was doing the FATS data yesterday, I did various evolutions of the data until I realized that the Africa aggregates for ACD were completely, they were full of holes. The data was full of holes, and so and obviously FATS data is one way of collecting data. Cross border is another way. Consumption abroad is another way. Each of those different modes is different type of data and different ways of collecting it. So yeah, where you're collecting via the balance of payments route rather than the customs border route, more challenging, more need to collect, to clean it up, to verify it. And we were looking at, in those figures, we were looking at total employment. We weren't looking at the turnover figures were not good. The value added figures were not good. But fortunately, we can count employees and then get an idea. So collection of data, collection of trade and services data, which is harder than merchandise data, will need to be prioritized. Otherwise, you can't really make policy if you don't know what you're regulating.
John, thank you so much for that reminder of how important trade data is, and a lot of work that still remains. Ladies and gentlemen, we've covered an enormous amount of ground, and I see that coming through the comments, where a number of you are asking us please to share the presentations with you. Just to assure you that we are going to be doing that, and there will be a Tralac newsletter going out on Friday, which will include all the presentations and also all the background notes, which cover in detail some of the issues we have been discussing today. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the work on the African Continental Free Trade Area that Tralac is engaged in is taking us to some very, very interesting issues. And as Willemien has indicated, when it comes to answering the very basic question of who will negotiate with whom, that question is, of course, informed by an understanding and interpretation of Article 19.2, Article 8.2 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods, but also of the principle of the acquis, which is not defined in the agreement. But the basic conclusion is that the regional economic communities will continue to exist. Intra-Africa trade is highly concentrated within those existing regional economic communities. More than 50%, for example, is conducted among the member states of the Southern African Development Community. The contribution of the AfCFTA, ladies and gentlemen, will be to open new opportunities for trade. trade between Southern Africa and West Africa, Southern Africa and North Africa and Central Africa, East Africa and West Africa, which currently these member states are trading under the rules of the World Trade Organization. So there is scope for tariff liberalization. But I think taking messages from our presentations yesterday on trade facilitation and the lessons from COVID, we realize also that the non-tariff agenda is particularly important. Trade facilitation issues and other impediments to cross-border trade, trade across regions on the African continent may be far more serious impediments than the tariffs. But for certain products, and we see in our analysis, and we will send you some of those details in the newsletter as well, agricultural trade for certain products is still under serious tariff challenges. So there is scope for tariff liberalization to make a difference, to open new opportunities, but we have a lot of work to be done in the non-tariff space, improving customs and border management, reducing red tape, and taking a look at efficient management of our regulatory systems to facilitate access to our infrastructure services, transport, and also communication and financial services. So ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure to have you with us this morning. Thank you very much for joining the conversation. We will answer all the questions in the newsletter, and we look forward to meeting you again this afternoon at 3 o'clock for the final session. It remains for me, on your behalf, to thank all of our contributors, our panelists this morning, for their insights and their experience and sharing the research that they are working on. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Until later, we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.